everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
Hey, guys. I know we usually do like a bit, or we start talking about something totally unrelated to applied behavior analysis and the behavior analytic research that we love to discuss every single week on our show, but we do have a fourth very special guest co-host tonight. So I don't want to waste his time and make him sit here and listen to our chit chat,
rattling on,
waiting for our children to come out and bother us in our very professional recording studio here. So let's introduce our very special guest. Without any further ado, John O'Neill. John, thank you so much for coming over and being on the show tonight.
Thanks for having me, guys.
So tonight we're going to be talking about training in the police academy using behavior analytic principles, or I guess generally just using behavior analytic principles in law enforcement research. All right, John, how do you usually describe it when you're doing talks and when you're, getting ready to publish something, new in the field?
Yeah, so applications of behavioral science in police academy training is usually how I talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, behavioral science. Did you come to that on your own, or you heard that phrase used? Because I hear that sometimes in conferences. And
yeah, so behavioral science, I think, is just a term that is more readily accepted by the policing world in general. If you talk about behavior analysis, they don't necessarily know that that's a branch of psychology or that it's anything special. I mean, they talk about behavior analysis in more like colloquial terms, so they don't necessarily know what you mean. But if you say behavioral science, they know that you're talking about an actual science of behavior.
Okay.
They're thinking CSI. Dun, dun, dun.
Something like
Let's
that.
go
Yeah.
behavior analyze this dead person.
Yeah, you get the typical, are you going to behavior analyze me?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's your couch? I got to lie down on that or something? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, John, you're going to be talking about your work with law enforcement. But before you got into that, where did you start in the world of behavioral science and behavioral analysis?
So originally got into it down in Florida at USF, University of South Florida program, and started doing research actually in schizophrenia. So my master's thesis was on perspective taking related to folks with diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Neat.
Then moved on from there and went to Southern Illinois University, where my focus was on RFT and ACT.
What years?
And 2012 to 2015.
Oh, yeah. I was there way earlier. 2008.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was there for a brief stint.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's my general background in behavior analysis. And then, of course, I've managed to branch out into law enforcement as well.
Now, how did that come about? You just had an interest in law enforcement. You met a police officer, said, we need some behavioral science. Come on down to the precinct and we'll...
No, I actually met my would-be wife in the doc program at Southern Illinois University, and she was in a different lab. And I have no dating game, so of course I had my eyes on this cute girl from another lab in the program, and I felt like my behavior analysis game though was pretty strong. So I was like, all right, how do I get this girl's attention? So of course, like a complete nerd, I suggested that we get together for coffee and talk about how RFT and ACT can relate to her specialty, which is older adults. She was foolish enough to fall into the trap, and we got talking, and the more we spent time with one another, she always, like late nights, doc program discussions, talking about research. And she always talked about this research institute that she worked for that does applied research with law enforcement and police officers, and it directly benefits the field. So it just became a topic of conversation that we always kept coming back to. And when it came time to apply for jobs at the end of the doc program, of course, we were applying for academic jobs, had some interviews set up. But we always had this in the back of our mind, thinking about, is there some potential that we could end up working with police officers somehow? So we decided to propose to the company that they hire both of us as full-time researchers, and they were silly enough to hire both of us to run their research department. Yeah, so it was a really good opportunity, and I've always been interested in studying things that were kind of outside the norm in behavior analysis. So it was a great opportunity to do that.
So when we see the O'Neill in the article, it wasn't just a fluke, kind of name just kind of popped up, what are the odds?
Not a fluke. That's my wife, Dr. Dawn O'Neill, and she and I had obviously a lot of input on the direction of the research. The institute that we worked for is interdisciplinary, so of course we tried to insert as much behavior analysis as we could.
Excellent. Well, we should probably list what articles we'll mainly be discussing, though. Again, we won't be going into necessarily, as much detail because these are going to be topics that it's more the principles and the use of them in a new setting that I think is going to be more fascinating for the listeners. Although, John, you did promise you're going to show us how to do our baton strike. We're going to do our reverse handcuff, whatever the other move was. A couple other ones. No. So we're going to be talking about 2 articles. The first is Functional Behavior Assessment of the Unintentional Discharge of Firearms in Law Enforcement by John, and that was in the Journal of Organizational Behavior Management in 2018. And then we'll be moving into its online first. So this is a 2019 article, Police Academy Training, Performance, and Learning by John, and as you said, by Dawn, and then also by Weed, Hartman, Spence, and Lewinski. All right, so in terms of kind of even thinking about how to organize these, John, could you talk about generally how you, whether it was you yourself or you and the team, got the idea of conducting this research, and then how you thought how you were going to quantify any of this? Because it seems like 2 very, very broad topics that you'd think there'd already be a lot of data sets on, but even in reading about the police academy training, maybe not as much as one would imagine for an organization that's been around for so very long.
Yeah, and that kind of goes for a lot of research, especially applied research in the policing world. There's just not that much applied, directly applicable research. So the first one, the FBA of unintentional discharges, kind of came about when the director of the institute wanted to put together a taxonomy of how unintentional discharges occur. So I guess it'd be good to give a sort of a definition of unintentional discharges. It's basically when a discharge of a firearm occurs in an unplanned manner. So we're not talking about when somebody's accidentally shot. We're talking about when the officer accidentally fires their weapon when they had no intention to do so. And the vast majority of them occur outside of active duties, outside of responding to a call or use of force situations, that kind of thing. A lot of them actually occur in pretty sterile environments like the office, in training environments. And
like in their pockets.
Yeah, in squad cars, when they're transferring the weapons to and from different locations. Basically, a lot of them come down to complacency, really, or insufficient training on how to handle the firearms. So they're mistakes, essentially, is what it comes down to.
It's not like, oops, I accidentally shot that person.
No.
That gets its own category.
Yeah, and actually in the study we did have a few where somebody was accidentally shot, but it tended to be either the officer themselves or another officer who was nearby.
Oh.
Yeah, so there were a handful of fatalities actually in the study, but most of them, the bullet ended up in the ground somewhere or in a wall or,
like,
no one was injured.
In the actual study?
The reports that we used for the study?
Yeah,
there were actual injuries and a couple of deaths involved. So it's a very serious phenomenon that we were studying. Obviously, it wasn't an experimental study, so we weren't placing
It's good to clarify that, right?
Yeah.
For our listeners, that's what I was trying to get at, right? Because
we did not kill any police officers.
John's following people around. This is a condition where I need you to use this gun, and it's the wrong size for your holster. Okay, go. I'm going to watch you.
Yeah, and that's kind of the conundrum in doing applied research, specifically with unintentional discharges. It's a very dangerous thing to tool around with when it comes to research, right? So we had to rely on reports of existing unintentional discharges.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So we gathered information from 11 different law enforcement entities, and there's actually this overall study, it's kind of a review paper, is based on 2 previous studies that were published in Applied Ergonomics. So this one summarizes everything and kind of draws everything together. So yeah, we started out trying to develop a taxonomy, and we struggled at first, like, how do we categorize these and put them into different groups that make sense? And we kind of kicked around the idea of grouping them into operant groups. It was difficult because the consequence is always the same, right? The consequence is always the firearm was discharged unintentionally. But what we quickly figured out was that all the antecedents were different. So we ended up grouping them into antecedent classes based on the reports and all the information that was provided in the actual reports from the law enforcement entities.
And did that come about just sifting through report after report after report and just trying to come up with a categorization that made sense in terms of those antecedent?
Yeah, it was a lot of sifting through the data, seeing what kind of made sense. Like this type of antecedent could be grouped with this one that makes sense going together. And yeah, we ended up with 6 different distinct classes of behavior that the officers were engaged in immediately prior to the unintentional discharge.
Okay. That was with the low intensity, high intensity, medium intensity, or that was?
No, so there are 6 different antecedent classes that we identified. And then within that, we had 3 different levels of what we called stress levels. So those would be the low and high intensity groups. So that was sort of a separate analysis.
Okay. Oof.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to back up. Do all precincts keep track of these data, or was it hard to find the data to start with?
No, there's actually no requirements in a lot of agencies to actually keep this sort of data on file. And you can imagine that if a police officer were to accidentally fire their weapon at home, for example, they may or may not report that because you're obviously going to be pretty embarrassed that something like that happens.
There might be the report of, we're the police. We heard there were reports of a gunshot in this area.
Right. So the vast majority of the ones that we have were on duty, but we did have a handful that occurred while an officer was in a hotel when they were at home.
You got to account for that damage, right?
Yeah. There was one where an officer knocked his firearm off of a bedside table kind of thing and tried to grab it as it was falling to the ground, accidentally pulled the trigger. So a whole host of... No, that one put a hole in the floor, I believe.
That's fair.
Yeah. There were many, many different situations, so it took a long, long time to sort them into groups and categories that sort of made sense behaviorally.
Did you find there was anything, as you were going through all the reports, that there was something missing that you wish had been present that would have made the job of the analysis easier? Or was it just sort of, you had so much information, it was just how to organize it?
Yeah, I mean, we had enough information to develop the taxonomy. The one thing that was missing that I would really like to have is the first-hand report from the officer themselves. So these reports are based on their interviews with their superiors after the fact. So that information is not going to be exact, I would imagine. So it'd be nice to be able to interview the officer myself and maybe get some additional information about what actually occurred. Generally, the reports were rich with information that we could use. I mean, we had firearm types. Perhaps a lot of the listeners don't know that different firearms have different types of triggers that have different mechanisms, like how they work. They also have different, what they call poundage. So it takes a certain amount of strength to actually pull the trigger. Some are lighter than others. Some are much heavier. And obviously that's going to influence whether or not the actual mechanism is going to be triggered and an unintentional discharge will occur. So yeah, it was rich with information. So it was trying to figure out what was relevant to what we were trying to accomplish in developing a behavior analytic taxonomy.
So following you put together the report, you completed the FBA. And, you don't have to get too deep into the findings because, again, a lot of them are going to be, as reading the article, I don't know what any of these mean, or this is not going to be relevant to anything I'll do possibly ever if you're not a gun owner. But sort of what were the general patterns that you were noticing?
The general pattern was that the vast majority of these are occurring in low stress situations. So outside of active calls or use of force, they're happening in the training facility. A handful were in bathrooms, in offices, at home, in squad cars. So I guess the takeaway is that the vast majority of them are preventable with sufficient training under low stress situations. So I think that's the main takeaway that we found. The general trend was that a lot of these can be addressed through training.
What would the normal training be and not what you did?
We didn't do any specific training for this. We have a lot of suggestions on how we think that are informed by the data that we have.
In the article,
Yeah. So generally, they go through their regular firearms training, which is going to vary from department to department. You'll see a trend here, too, across both of these studies, is that there's no real standardization on how the trainings are conducted or how they're tested for fluency as well. So yeah, it's pretty interesting that the checks and balances are not as strict as you might imagine sometimes. Obviously, some departments have much better training than others, but they all use different firearms too. There's a handful of firearms that are pretty common, but I think we had 40 or 50 different types of firearms in our study.
Really?
Wow, that's a
Just
lot of firearms.
In the office, officers across the 11, they were in districts, or it was 11 precincts, districts? I'm not sure I know the difference.
So we had 10 city or regional entities that were working with us. We had one international entity that worked with us. But even across the U.S., there's no real standardization on the type of firearm or the training that goes along with that firearm.
Wow. I always assumed since it was a government entity, it was, well, we got the deal for the 9mm whatever, and that's what everyone's going to get because we got them at a discount or something. So,
and that is the case in a lot of states, but officers often have the option to carry a different type of firearm if they wish to purchase their own.
Oh.
Did not know that.
So I'm going to let you all in a secret about my knowledge of policing. I once did play the old computer game called Police Quest, which did force you to read an abridged police officer's manual.
Wow, Rob.
Yeah, I know you can't have a mustache. Maybe this has changed. But as of 1985, when this game came out, you can't have a mustache unless you're a detective, I think. Maybe they changed that. And that's all I remember because I lost very quickly because I didn't follow proper procedure. But like if you brought the gun into the police station, it was game over. You just start the whole game again.
See, there you
Wow.
go.
Yeah, so
Right?
so I never got to, I guess I never got to the part about I could buy my own gun.
Discharge.
No. They would bust you for that. You lose points and then you lose the game. That's all I know, though. So, John, feel free.
So
you
glad
can
you brought that
fill
up.
in any extra information you've learned about policing.
I mean,
Wait,
speaking about losing the game,
but can you have a mustache?
most departments no. These days they kind of frown upon facial hair. But again, that varies widely from department to department. Tattoos are becoming much more prevalent. A lot of departments were completely against officers having tattoos and facial hair, but I think they're coming around to the idea that a lot of folks live that sort of lifestyle and have tattoos and facial hair, and they don't want to limit the folks that are applying to work as officers.
So were the departments interested in getting the reports after this, or did you notice any changes in terms of policy, or were there questions?
Yeah, we're following up with at least 3 of the departments, and they're providing us with data on an ongoing basis. So every year we get an update from them and get their yearly unintentional discharge data so that we can continue to develop and see if we find any things that we might have missed in the taxonomy that we developed. We think we have it pretty well covered, but who knows? There might be something that we missed that might show up in a unique case at some point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even you mentioned some of the reports or what reports went in, looking at your taxonomy now, you sort of could even standardize some of those reports. What are the checklist of the common problems occurring to, make it easier so you needed less training if you were, say, the officer in charge of filling out those reports after the fact. I know I got to hit these 6 because it's probably one of these 6, or there's a good chance one of these 6. And then, the other section where the officer with a medical condition. I know that was one of the one.
Yeah, the one, right. And took quite a while before we came across a UD. We just call them UDs, short for unintentional discharge. But it took us a while to come across one that was a result of a startle response. And in the previous existing literature, there were only 3 different types that could occur. It was either a startle response or an unintentional contraction of a muscle that was in conjunction with doing something else. So if you're jumping or exerting like pushing open a door or something like that, you get a small amount of contraction in the other appendage. So,
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I am going to watch my hand now.
Well,
I've been learning so many things. Underpants. I just learned about underpants.
That was a different episode.
Oh, yeah.
And
you weren't here for that
one. Wow.
Yeah, so that's something we learned from jumping into the medical literature, because before we conducted these studies, all of the existing evidence was from medical studies.
Yeah.
And they focused heavily on muscle contractions and startle responses. So something that we added was, of course, all of the antecedent behaviors that the officers were engaged in prior to, which included things like muscle contractions and startle responses. But the vast majority of them did not include that sort of thing, and were more to do with kind of general day-to-day activities that officers engage in.
That was the most vivid. I know that's not ever really the goal necessarily of an article, of like making an exciting section, but that was probably the most exciting one. The idea of like, the unintentional discharge of the officer is like leaping the counter where he's got switching the gun from hand to hand. It sounded very complicated. But I just thought that part was very exciting. But again, not the main time that unintentional discharges would be occurring. So I get, like you mentioned, the pattern that came from this study, or the patterns that you saw in this study, were pretty similar to the ones that you saw in the follow-up study in terms of police academy training. So was the genesis of that research sort of the same idea? It was, hey, let's continue on this line. If this very potentially serious problem has been sort of not necessarily underreported, but understudied, Are there going to be other areas in law enforcement that need that study, or did it come about in a different way?
Not so much. These were just two areas of focus that we were kind of handed, and they thought that our expertise in behavior analysis would be really applicable.
Mm-hmm.
The police academy training studies, the initial idea was to go in and just look at how effective their current training methods are. But as we got into it, we realized that, there are some issues here, and we think that they can do a lot better with what they have, the resources that they have. And I think that we have a lot that we can provide and give them feedback on how to improve their training.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that one, the training studies sort of blossomed as we went on. And of course, you see in the third study that we were actually able to provide some feedback to them and ultimately improve the delivery of their training.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So in terms of kind of switching gears to the police training study, unlike just looking through reports, you actually got to go into the police academies to observe. So you got to see all of the training in action. And I know you mentioned in the introduction that some of this came from, well, at least tangentially was related to some of the increased focus on standardization and improvement and use of data in improving law enforcement. That was a presidential, or I'm blanking on that.
The presidential task force, is that what you're referring to?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so there was a call for improvements in police academy training, including evidence-based implementation, more research in the area. Standardization was a topic as well, although that's very difficult because each state has different requirements and different lengths of academies and different resources. But generally, there was a call from the presidential task force for essentially more science in law enforcement training.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
I love science.
It's all right.
It gets the job done, I guess, yeah. But John, in terms of going to the academies and in talking to so many different officers, did you ever get a sense, or would it not be appropriate to even maybe kind of opine on the reason that there hasn't already been this work done? Because I think of policing as something that's been around forever. Therefore, someone at some point in the, hundreds of years that there have been law enforcement type officers said, you know what we should do? Gather more data, or look at how our procedures are done systematically. Mm-hmm. And for that to not only now be, brought up seems a bit odd. Do you have a sense as to why that might be, or?
Yeah, I think it comes down to a tradition, and basically this is how we've always done it. Mm-hmm. It's worked. It's not broken necessarily. Mm-hmm. So why change something that's not broken? As far as conducting research, I think it takes a substantial effort on the part of departments to actually conduct applied research. Mm-hmm. I mean, especially in behavior analysis, our methods and procedures are very, very time and resource intensive. So it takes a substantial effort, and they're already highly taxed. Their schedules are already packed full of just trying to get the training done that they need to. Mm-hmm. Research is an afterthought, and I think that's probably the primary reason why not much research has been done in the area.
Mm-hmm. Man, when you say that, I feel bad that I even asked the question. It's like, you're right. They're doing so much already, and no one's ever as funded as they want to be. So, yeah, we need to research our procedures more. Budget probably pales in comparison to the need this many officers, need this many supplies. Can't have everyone buy their own gun, because then we're going to have more unintentional discharges because now they're not trained in all these different firearms. All these other pieces.
I don't have specific examples, but in speaking to trainers and police officers in general, I know that they've been burned by researchers in the past. Folks coming in with a specific goal that they want to accomplish for their specific research line, and not necessarily taking into account whether or not it's going to directly benefit the department or the officers themselves. Right?
That's unfortunate, right?
Yeah, I think it is. But that's the beauty of behavior analysis, is that everything that we do should be applicable and should benefit them directly.
Mm-hmm. Can you name names as to kind of what lines of research, or is that?
I'm not going to bash on mainstream psychology, but I think there's probably quite a bit of that going on. Mm-hmm. But, everyone wants to work with police officers. It's a very enticing area to get into. Mm-hmm. So they're probably hearing from researchers left and right, and they don't know who to trust or who's going to have their best interest in mind. True. So it's probably too much of a risk to get involved with someone that they're not familiar with and don't necessarily trust.
Mm-hmm. So did you find that at all in your research, or was just your remit of, we're just gathering information because we want to help you come up with more effective ways to do the things you were already doing, just that kind of struck a chord with the folks you were working with?
Yeah, so we were lucky enough to have a retired police officer as part of this study. That's William Spence. He's one of the co-authors.
Oh, excellent.
So he helped us and gave us a lot of guidance on how to be careful about not insulting people.
It's really important, right?
Yeah,
and you don't
yeah.
even mean to do it, right?
Exactly.
I bet that's the thing. You just say something and it could be like off the cuff, but
Yeah. Well, it's a completely different world, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
just because you know something about science doesn't necessarily mean you know how to apply it in this particular arena. So he helped us.
right.
He helped shape and guide us in the right direction so that we didn't overexert ourselves or insert ourselves and suggest that we have the end-all be-all answer to all of their problems. We were just there to see how their training operates, see what the outcomes were, and then hopefully provide some feedback and help them improve it.
And that certainly reads in the article. It's very, I assume you guys had to put some more time in. You had Officer Spence helping you out with it, but it definitely read very much as very, respectful to the folks who are working on the material and very informative, which at least like you kind of already mentioned, one of the groups seems to really have liked working with all of you because they asked for a little bit extra information as well in the process.
That's how you know, right?
I know when you get to add more to your research because the
Right?
participants are like, come on, do more research. You know you're on the right track.
If they ask you back,
Yeah.
you know that you're on the right track,
It's a
right?
good feeling.
You're winning.
Yeah.
All right. Well, John, I want to get into the nitty gritty of the second article, but first we're going to take a little break and then we'll come back talking to Dr. O'Neill about research in law enforcement.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking to our special guest, Dr. John O'Neill, about research related to work with law enforcement. And we're going to be talking about training and how training goes in law enforcement. But first, before we do that, I want to make sure that our listeners know that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to our show, you can earn not type 2. They're just learning credits nowadays. Learning credit. I got to get used to that in the new year. You just need to listen to the show and then go to abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs and then put in our 2 secret code words. I'm going to give you the first one now. It's Hightower. HIGHTOWER. I bet some of you might know where that code word came from. If you do, write us an email and tell us, and we'll have a good laugh all together. Hightower. All right, so let's get back into your and your team's research, John, on working in the police academies. So you were going to go in and get a sense of what are the types of training provided in the different academies, and there were 3 different academies that you were in.
3 different ones, yeah.
Question about that. So you said there was like 28 week, 26 week. Does that mean that they were only open half a year?
No, so academies do multiple cohorts per year.
Okay.
So each particular cohort was
it
26 or 28 weeks.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
I was like, how can they be part-time? Like, when do they not? Is it winter because they don't like heat the facility? As I'm reading it, I don't know.
It's, the winter police semester, Jackie. I mean, you know how it is.
So that's how long it takes to go through police
Right.
academy training? Is
Yeah.
about 6 months.
It makes a lot more sense
The
now.
officers need summer off
is a
to go on
good amount of
vacation.
time.
Right? So, John, in general, are you able to speak generally about what the average sort of police academy experience is like? And we know we have these different cohorts, because you were looking at very specific skills and how they were trained.
Yeah.
But you sort of, in describing the fact that the officers could be practicing, some of the techniques at other times. I know that, at least from movies, which may or may not be correct, there's both learning the physical skills needed, but there's also, the book learning of, how are you going to learn? You can't have a facial hair in your department unless you go sit in the class where they teach that. Probably other things too.
Yeah, so you have the physical skills training, defensive tactics, and all that good stuff that we conducted our studies on. You obviously have firearms training. You have the classroom training where you learn the policies and procedures of your particular department, the state laws and all that. You have the law side. They obviously have to learn about the law, how to operate within the law. So those are the three main sections that they go through. So quite a bit of classroom time, quite a bit of seminar time, and then obviously the physical skills piece is mixed in. But it varies widely from department to department what the schedule looks like. Some departments, you have classroom in the morning and then physical skills in the evening. Some do it the other way around. They get the physical stuff out first thing in the morning and then classroom in the evening. But it's sort of like, I don't know, it would be like if behavior analysts were housed in a residential facility and had to learn all of their skills, for 26 weeks straight, every day, all day.
They spend the night there?
Some do. Yeah, some have residential facilities where they have bunks and they have their own facilities on campus, yeah.
I would love that.
To be in a bunk area where you were stuck for 26 weeks just
behavior
learning?
Analyst bunk camp.
Ooh.
It actually sounds pretty fun.
Maybe it's the only way to meet the demand, I guess. We got to just start getting the academies together, right?
We keep churning them out at this rate, yeah.
I'm going to ask my institution where I work, hey, do you want to have a intense 28-week boot camp for behavior analysts where they just sleep in the dorms? They'll say no, but that would be fun.
So if you're attending police academy training, are you going to end up working with those folks who are in your cohort, or they then get scattered?
That depends too. If it's a city department, then they're likely going to end up working in that city. Otherwise, they would have to go through a different city's academy training. There are also regional facilities, so one facility for the entire state. So everyone comes in, they learn the particular methods and procedures and policies that are relevant to their department, and then they go back out and get specialized training for their particular city or town or region.
Okay. I guess I was thinking the sleepaway camp aspect could really be rapport building if you end up working with those folks, but you may or may not do that.
Right, yeah.
I'd assume you also don't want to have a police department made up entirely of brand new police officers.
Good luck, town.
Or you're a really small town, like a Twin Peaks or whatever. Maybe you're going to be okay.
Well, that's the thing, too. Some departments only have a handful of people if it's a small town department, whereas Boston PD, thousands and thousands of officers, right?
Yep. So I didn't even think about this until you were mentioning the different skills that need to be learned in a police academy, John. But did you want to focus on the physical component, or was there ever a thought of, what about the procedures? That can be important too. Maybe not as visible, but I know that there's always a concern with, not always, but there's certainly a concern with law enforcement officers that they're overstepping their bounds in ways that are inappropriate, not physically doing so, but in terms of what the rights of the citizenry are compared to what a police officer can do. Again, maybe that's just me in cop shows, and that's not actually reality, but...
Well, yeah, part of obviously the physical training component goes along with like de-escalation tactics, their verbal rapport with citizens and that sort of thing. So our focus obviously was on physical skills training, but as I was walking around the academy and interacting with these folks, my research radar was going off left and right, like, we could do something over here, we could do something over there. So there's just, there's a career worth of research that could be conducted. So if you have a good relationship with a police department, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it would be beneficial, just thinking about how many growth areas there would be, and policing is very visible. Everybody has had some sort of an interaction with a police officer. Not all of them have been positive.
Yeah. And
some of them might have been aversive because of an error on the police officer's part. Some of it might not have been. Certainly, if you get pulled over for a speeding ticket, 100% of what the police officer should do could have been perfectly done. You're still probably not thinking so highly of the interaction. But
yeah, and I think there's the other side of the coin, too, where how much training does the general public get on how to interact with police officers?
Right.
So you're pulled over on the highway. What should you do so that you're not setting off the police officer's radar like, this is a sketchy subject? What can you do to maintain your own safety and the safety of the officer, how can you interact with them appropriately and not get yourself in trouble that you wouldn't otherwise have been in?
My husband hopped out of the car. He got pulled over for making an illegal turn because my daughter had to pee. And she was like, I have to go bad.
Mm-hmm.
And he pulled her over and he went back and was like writing out a ticket. And my husband got out of the car and was like holding Sylvia, and she's like peeing on the side of the road. And I was like, that was dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You could have gotten, like, that's one thing we kind of all know that you shouldn't do. Get out of the car.
Yeah, I mean,
right? Like,
not to mention, you're putting undue stress on the officer, obviously, because they're wondering what you're doing.
Right.
Also, you could get hit by traffic.
Right. There's like a ton of things there. And everything was fine, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was not a big deal. She peed. She was great. He got back in. The cop was like, I saw you had your kid. I knew she had to pee, but don't do that.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, also, I mean, keeping your documents and whatever you need if you do get pulled over, have them in a specific place, because if you're going rummaging around your different departments in the car, that officer's going to be wondering what the heck you're doing as they approach you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I was pulled over once and I thought I better get my registration out, because the officer's going to need that, because I've seen enough shows. So I'm like going in my glove box, like right away, hadn't been asked. And the officer was very kind and said, like, sir, please in the future, don't start going into your glove box until I ask you to. And I felt so bad. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I don't want you to think I was like going to reach for a gun. I feel so bad. Because, I'm not happy about this interaction, but I don't want you to, I'm not that angry about it.
Now he's wondering, why is this guy talking about guns?
Yeah, and then the follow-up of like, oh, sorry, officer, I won't shoot you. This poor officer's not having a great time right now.
But yeah, in general, I think there's a lot of research that could be done on teaching the general population on how to interact with officers.
I agree.
Mm-hmm. And John, you bring up the good point too of with training, having a set criteria, having things be well trained, because if they're not, there's a chance that you have officers who are not intending to engage in a more intensive procedure than they would like to. But if they're not well trained enough in some of the techniques, they could very easily escalate from what should be a simple process of de-escalation to something that requires much more physicality.
Yeah, absolutely. If the officer is not completely confident in their verbal skills, their de-escalation skills, then maybe they're more likely to rely on higher levels of force. And that goes all the way up to use of firearms,
Yeah. So in terms of your overall research, you were looking at 3 different academies and you were looking at 3 different styles of training, correct?
Yeah, so even within the 3 departments that we chose to work with, we had 3 different variations of training that were conducted.
On the same skill?
On very similar skills,
right.
Yeah. So you can imagine how many different variations there are across the United States.
Mm-hmm. So you had the block training method, there was the scenario-specific feedback, and then there was the block training with scenario-specific. It seemed like kind of an amalgamation of the first 2 experiments in terms of the training methods.
Yeah. So typically the block training approach is very common and very widespread. And then incorporating some sort of scenario-based training with that is pretty common too. Mm-hmm. They typically, when they teach a skill, they don't come back to it. So they teach it and they move on to the next one. They'll have an examination at the end of the academy that they have to pass, but they don't typically have a structured way to do booster trainings or to space the training out so that they're continually improving on the skill throughout the academy. It's typically one chunk around an hour. They teach that skill and then they move on to the next one because they have so much that they have to learn. Most academies, over 100 physical skills that they have to learn. And that's outside of all their classroom training, anything related to firearms or any other tools that they use.
Well, sometimes it seemed like the instructor to student ratio was somewhat high. I think experiment 2 is a 1 to 10 ratio of instructor to student. But it seemed like in experiment 1, it was not even close to the 1 to 10. It was, I don't know, 1 to like 16, 17. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was much higher than 1 to 10.
Yeah. Yeah, so that varies a lot. You're going to hear me say varies a lot because it just does. It's different at every academy. And it might even vary from trainer to trainer and how they go about teaching. So they may have 3 or 4 master trainers and groups of trainers that they supervise, but one master trainer may do something slightly different than the other. So it's another variable that comes into play. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think you guys all painted a really great word picture in terms of what the trainings looked like with the everyone, I'm going to show you how to do this. And then you described what the different techniques were. So you had there was the baton strike. There was I called it the kneeling handcuff, but that's not actually what the technical term was. It's just what I had in my notes. The snap kick, that seemed to be a control a lot of the time.
I like that.
The rear disarm, there was a pressure point. So you had all these different techniques across the 3 settings. But a lot of the training seemed to be, I'm going to show you how to do this. Break off into pairs, do it a couple times, maybe going around giving feedback, maybe doing that at the end. And then I saw a couple of you doing blank, remember to do it this way. And I'm picturing a lot of the physical trainings that I've done. I've sort of did more kind of, I think before you started seeing BST be such a component of training in anything related to behavior analysis, just kind of do it a little bit. Then it'll tell you, hey, I saw a couple of you do this wrong. But anyway, don't do that wrong again. Time to move on to the next skill.
Yeah, you're pretty on point with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all from your article. Kudos to you guys. That was exactly what I thought it was, and I'm glad to hear that was the...
Yeah, that's more or less how it went. So what we were able to introduce was objective measurements of the skills. We introduced task analyses. So many of the skills they didn't actually have a developed checklist. It was just, this is the skill and this is how we teach it. Yeah. All the master trainers know what it is. They're very well educated and skillful. But they didn't have a task analysis, so we helped them develop task analyses, and we actually found a couple of steps that they wouldn't necessarily have included, but that we found out was pretty important for the particular skill. And then, of course, including an experimental control aspect as well, so that we could really see the effects of the training. And
that was just having the control.
The control skill, and the staggered baselines as well, the multiple baseline, which was a task to get them to agree to do that.
Yeah.
I mean,
and you have concurrent.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a pretty large undertaking. So we had 30 to 40 site visits across, and there was one academy was on the East Coast, one was Central, and one was West Coast.
Oh, wow. That much of a regional difference.
30 to 40 site visits, and we accumulated 10,000 videos of these skills. So we had multiple angles of every participant performing every skill across multiple baseline points and multiple training points and follow-up points.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a massive undertaking. It took the better part of 3 years to conduct the 3 studies that are in that paper.
How did you set up video cameras in different places in the room so
we
you
had,
get all angles?
We had very specific placements for the cameras, so we had exactly the same angle so that we could see every step of the skill perfectly so that we didn't miss anything. Then we had multiple camera angles of the actual trainings themselves. I think we had 6 cameras at one point for the actual training sessions, so that we could see the number of practice repetitions that they got, how much feedback was being provided, and the modeling and all that good stuff. So, yeah, it was a pretty intensive data collection process.
Did anyone kick over a camera?
No, surprisingly.
They use their their untrained snap kick to knock over the...
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah, now that I think about it, I'm surprised that didn't happen at some point. We did have a battery go out a couple of times. So, but we had 5 others backing it up, so we were
out of
in
the
good shape.
10,000 samples, that's not too bad.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think
who coded all that, John?
Our wonderful graduate assistants.
Right. God bless them.
Yeah. I mean, months and months of data analysis.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and of course we had to have IOA because we're behavior analysis, so that just added on top as well. So yeah, it was a lot for sure.
So it did seem that there were some patterns in the data in terms of which methodologies seemed to have the most success, seemed to have the longest sort of tail in terms of the maintenance of the skills. Though, I mean, I guess in looking at the data, none of them were really like that slam dunk of that was the one that had the best training and everyone learned the skills and they kept them forever.
Yeah, so I think generally speaking, the most effective in terms of long-term maintenance of the skill was an initial longer training with follow-up booster sessions spaced about 10 days apart, 3 of those. And then after the final testing throughout the rest of the academy, they occasionally came back and did a really brief refresher on that skill. And that helped to maintain the skill throughout the, 16-week follow-up period that we had. That one seemed to be the way to go as far as the procedures and methods that we looked at. However, it's, far from perfect.
No. And even within those results, when you did get a higher mean of success, you'd still have your outliers.
Yeah, we always had those stragglers. And we even did analyses that are not included in the paper looking at the folks that were initially low.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't always end up the folks that had the low scores. Sometimes they ended up with top of the class marks. Other times they did stay in the lower half sort of thing. But some of the initial high-performing folks ended up being on the lower end. Mm. So it wasn't easy to predict who were going to be your high performers, which was interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting that someone would go from high to low.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what was going on there. I think probably it had something to do with, I mastered that. I don't have to worry about that one too much. And then just gradually the skill kind of fell off.
Some drift there.
Yeah, I think a little bit of drift. So I can give you some kind of our key findings. Every time I present this to police officers, they like when we start with the key findings and then get into all the nitty-gritty sciencey stuff.
Oh, they don't want it to be like the fun, climax, and then the research was over and the results were.
Yeah.
I like that.
You're basically like a poster, right? You know how you always start with like the
I want a story.
Conclusions.
Yeah, give me the takeaways, give me some buy-in, and then tell me all your
I want an exciting story with a beginning and a middle and an end. I want lots of details, character development. That's what I want in my research.
Yeah, so the block training, which is just, one session of training for a skill and move on, typically resulted in 60 to 70% accuracy. Obviously, that's below what we typically use as an 80% mastery criterion, right? Mm-hmm. This is a lot of the behavior analytic research.
And as a citizen, I really don't want to hear I'm going to be your officer today. Don't worry, I was about 65% on many of my skills at the academy.
Exactly. Yeah, I always bring that up too. What sort of mastery criterion should we have in place for folks who have other people's lives in their hands?
I'm like high 90s, maybe?
Yeah, right. Without practice after that initial training session, the skills often fall off pretty quickly after the initial testing. Within 2 to 4 weeks, they were well below any sort of mastery criterion. Generally speaking, the instructors, before we gave them any feedback, did not provide enough corrective feedback for their students. They tended to focus on what they were doing wrong as well, as opposed to reinforcing what they were doing correctly and building off of that, shaping, right? So we noticed that across all 3 academies as well. They're teaching way too many skills to be effective or efficient when you have 100+ skills to learn. The learning and retention of those skills is going to suffer when you have that much to teach in such a short training academy duration, right? 26 weeks, 100 skills. It basically whittles down to you spend about an hour on each individual skill and move on.
It's not just this component. This is the 100 skills of the physical component, but there's all the other
plus hundreds
firearm
more,
safety and policies and procedures and all the other stuff that you're fitting in 26 weeks. So
yeah, and then finally, if we take a mastery criterion of 80%, which is typical in the scientific literature, many of these cadets graduated based on our task analyses and our scoring and our data analysis, graduated without a mastery criterion level performance of those skills.
Oof. When you tell that to officers at various trainings, do you get a lot of what? Oh my, are they shocked? Or are they sort of well, no, that makes sense considering how little time there is to learn everything?
A little bit of both. Mm-hmm. They understand that their resource limitations. I'm not knocking them. They do an excellent job with what the time and resources that they have. Yeah. But yeah, there's definitely a little bit of both going on there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the skills are not necessarily mastered, but the mindset is that, they're going to get out in the field and they're going to continue learning, right? And I think that's common in behavior analysis too, right? We do initial training for direct care staff. They pass. Whether or not they've mastered that skill is questionable, but we put them to work and they continue to learn, or we hope that they continue to learn. So I think that's sort of a similar approach, is they need to get out there and work and actually continue to learn.
And maybe do some in vivo trainings if necessary, right?
Yeah.
Ideally. Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess the question would be, what does supervision for rookie police officers look like in terms of, hey, everybody, it's Friday. We're going to be doing a refresher. We're going to go through all the different, procedures. This week it's going to be physical. Next week it's going to be class-based or policy and procedure, then firearms. Or, always paired with a mentor who's able to sort of continue doing checks like you'd sort of hope you'd have with your supervisor, which maybe you don't always have with a supervisor, even in our field where we should know better.
Yeah, so some departments do have mentor training like that, and of course they're going to get feedback from their supervisors and that sort of thing. But when it comes to academy training, the typical retraining period is at 1 year.
Mhm.
So our research is suggesting that these skills have fallen off by the end of the first quarter
Mhm.
in 2 to 3 months, but they're not retrained. They're not required to come in for retraining any more than once a year.
So would that be sort of a potential recommendation of? Well, that was one of your recommendations.
Yeah,
right? Was the
absolutely, yeah.
retraining.
Yeah, and I think they realize that, but imagine the cost of bringing thousands of officers in to retrain every 2 months maybe.
Mhm.
It's a massive drain on the resources of the departments. So they need more money, they need more time, and they need more resources in general. And I think they could benefit from a lot of technologies as well, like video modeling, for example, video trainings and those sorts of things.
Well, I'd also wonder, even just looking at initial analysis, you have that sort of within 2 months, you have that drop, or not even within 2 months, you have that big drop off. How many times, though, do you need a refresher before you stop seeing that drop off? Is there ever a point at which I've done the snap kick so many times, I'm never going to forget it. I see it in my dreams. Or is it one of those like, well, there's less drop off, but there's always that tail end, maybe eventually it's a year, but how many repetitions before you get there? Those are the.
Yeah. And a lot of the skills have critical pieces that if you don't get that correct, then the rest of the skill sort of falls apart. So maybe they need to focus more heavily on those critical aspects in the retrainings to make sure that they're getting those, because if they don't get that, then the rest of the skill is not going to be good. So yeah, that's definitely something that we recommended that they do.
So talk about in experiment 3, you had an extra section on performance feedback training, which didn't seem like it was originally part of the experiment, but based on instructor request, you did a mini training on performance feedback. What did that process look like? Was it as sort of sudden and happily unexpected as it kind of sounded like in the research, or?
Yeah, it was. We developed a really good relationship with the trainers. We had a lot of discussions outside of the research itself on how we thought that they could improve the delivery of their training. So from those discussions, when we sort of wrap the study up, they said, well, why don't you do a training for us and the cadets and tell us your findings and give us some feedback and go from there.
How open of them.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, these are folks that are incredibly passionate about their field. I mean, they have a huge responsibility to the people that they train as well. So they want to do the best job that they possibly can. And of course, we didn't want to go in guns blazing and say, oh, we think you should do this. Here's where you're not doing so great. Because these are folks who have 15, 20 years of experience in training these skills.
Yeah.
The way you become a police academy trainer is you have to be nominated for that position. So it's a really big honor to be a police academy trainer. So these are folks that are very good at their jobs. And for me to just waltz in and tell them that they're doing everything wrong and, you need to do BST, behavioral skills training, right? It just wouldn't have been the best approach. So when they openly asked us for feedback, of course, we were more than happy to provide it to them.
You weren't like, no, here's what it looks like. No.
So then they wanted to run it with the class. So they brought them in for a special booster training that was based on our behavior analytic feedback. We worked directly with each of the trainers and suggested where they could make some improvements based on our observations during the training. And they implemented it and had some pretty nice results that came from it,
Yeah.
Any follow-up?
For the...
Like, have they called you back?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so it's not published yet, but we did a second study with this particular academy as well. So they asked us to work with their next cohort, do exactly the same thing. We did the performance feedback session as well. And then we also incorporated some video modeling. This one's not published yet. Hopefully it'll be coming out later this year.
Yes, everyone.
So it's a comparison of video modeling in person versus the modeling provided by the instructor themselves. So
Did you like wheel in the big TV?
Yeah.
Right? Just like in an elementary school. And everyone's like, a video's coming.
Gather around, kids. Yeah. Yeah, so we did that comparison with the same cohort. So it was nice to be asked back to conduct another study with them. So yeah, hopefully that one will be coming out sometime soon.
So you're like flying around all these different places?
Yeah, we're flying all over the country. Wow. Lots of flights, lots of long hours doing data collection because The research component couldn't occur during the regular schedule at the academy. It had to be done either very early morning or after their regular schedule. So yeah, lots of long hours and lots of data analysis.
Now, John, some of the other recommendations that you made in the paper related to kind of more general principles. So I know you mentioned like possibly looking at the idea of the public posting, more direct reinforcement or positive reinforcement, maybe some homework tasks. But those just kind of generally came from areas that you'd seen in other fields. I think you specifically mentioned in athletics training, correct? That wasn't based on something directly you saw?
Yeah, so something that's very common in the exercise science literature is variation in the training trials. So varying how the skill is practiced, who it's practiced with, and those sorts of things. So yeah, that was a recommendation that came from outside the behavior analytic literature. But I think even within behavior analysis, it's pretty obvious that variability is a very important aspect of learning skills. Yeah, we had a number of other suggestions like group contingencies, public posting, and pairing folks into groups and having them compete against one another, because there's a lot of friendly competitiveness that goes on in police academies. So taking advantage of that to help them not only learn from one another, but develop a little bit of friendly competition as well.
Maybe a little mini gamification of some of the,
the
the components.
Be interesting to see how that played out. That sounds cool.
What?
Yeah.
I'm all about the gamification.
I know you're all about the gamification. That's your
I'm
thing
less about
these
the
days.
public posting. I mean, I guess maybe you could do anonymous public posting of individual scores, but then people could have like a secret code that was their own number. I don't know. I feel nervous about like
it worked in
you
dance. Remember?
You only got 50%.
With the scorpion kick.
With the scorpion kick.
I know where you're going.
You know where I'm coming from, man.
Well, something we thought about to kind of de-identify the individuals was break them off into groups and just post the group score.
Okay. So
Oh,
like
there you
combine
go.
the two kind of, right? Yeah.
right.
That's nice.
Oh, I like that.
I like that too.
That's true. I mean, you don't have to know who did it necessarily. Well, you're continuing to work. You did the video modeling. I mean, in terms of thinking about the future, have you had any academies that have just said, we want the whole shebang. Tell us, like, make us a package. We want to see if it's effective or more effective or anything like that? Or is it really still in the early stages of kind of getting the buy-in and doing the exploratory observations?
Yeah, still sort of in the baby stages, right? I mean, these are just 3 studies that we're trying to generalize to the entire nation, essentially, right? I mean, it's
no big.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, when you put it that way, I guess it is a pretty big generalization task. Yeah.
When you take into account the amount of variability in the way that trainings are occurred and the methods and procedures that are used by particular departments, I think every academy training is going to need an individualized approach to their particular resources that they have available, which fits really well with behavior analysis. That's what we're good at doing. We're good at fitting our science to the needs of the population that we're working with. So, I mean, there are any number of additional studies that could be run in police academies. So yeah, we're hoping to get more done in the future for sure.
Do you have like a big book of them, John, where you like write down all your ideas and you kind of cross them out?
I do, yeah.
Your dream journal.
Your dream journal
I
of
have
research.
a dream list. There's about 8 of them on there that I really want to do. We managed to get the video modeling one out, which was kind of a no-brainer. But I'd love to do some of these incorporating variability in the training. I think those might have some pretty interesting results.
Do you think, like, kind of going back to some of the procedures that are already in place in terms of the scenario-specific feedback, like, do you think making that more concrete and then sort of planning for variability in terms of when each of the techniques would be used, do you think that would be helpful? Or is that not really how they were using the kind of scenario-related feedback in the training?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think the difficulty that you run into with our the behavior analytic approach of training to criterion, they run into a lot of issues because, well, how much time do we spend with this particular individual? They can't necessarily pull individuals aside and work with them one-to-one a lot of the time. They have to do it in a group format. So it's figuring out how to make that work within their schedule. And maybe some of it is individuals who need more work need to come outside of their regularly scheduled hours. Or maybe we can incorporate a lot of technologies where they can learn outside of the academy and do homework, for example. That's also a piece of the video modeling study that's going to be coming out. We gave them all of the instructions that we developed, so all the task analyses and all the video models, and all of the visuals that we developed, we gave them all to the cadets so that they could take them home and study outside of their regular hours.
I love that.
Oh.
They probably don't love it, but I love it.
It resulted in pretty substantial improvements in their scores, so it was definitely beneficial with the video modeling on top of it as well.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's an N of 1, but I know personally, anytime I've had to learn a new physical skill, if I've had a video to go back to, I have felt just so much better about being able to then model the skill to somebody else or to show the skill in a training. It's that great refresher of, okay, no, that's what I think it should look like. Now I can practice it. And I feel like I'm practicing off of something that's correct rather than my vague recollections of what I was supposed to look like. And then I have no way to compare it. So whatever I did, I guess that's 100% in my mind, even if it's not even close to what the model is.
Nailed it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, and everyone has a smartphone these days, right? So you have the capability to not only record the trainings themselves and how the skills are supposed to be performed, but you can record yourself and have somebody else provide you with feedback on how you demonstrated the skill. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for learning outside of the actual academy hours, which is not something that a lot of academies take advantage of.
But who knows? Maybe in the future.
Yeah.
There's this push. Well, let's get into, now that we've discussed the articles, into our dissemination station. So we've already talked a little bit about, dissemination, at least in terms of sort of future directions that your research is looking at in terms of the training for police academies. And then, John, you kind of already mentioned that possible lesson. So, again, most of the folks listening here are probably not going to, wake up after the day after they listen to this and say, I better get into police academy research too. And, start building their relationships. I mean, maybe, who knows? But most likely they will go to whatever their current job is as behavior analysts. So what are some findings or what are some general procedures and thinking that went into this research that you think would be appropriate for other behavior analysts working in other fields?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned it earlier, but police officers generally aren't even aware of our field as a science. So translating our technical terms into easily digestible language and relating to the officers is very, very important. So that's a huge one for sure. And just keeping in mind that these folks are very passionate about what they do. They're very good at what they do. So just being respectful of that and mindful of the fact that you're an outsider trying to come into an area that they are an expert in. So, yeah, just being careful about the way that you talk with them and try to find common grounds and ways that you can maybe provide some pointers for them.
Because you mentioned that earlier in our discussion, and it brought me back to a lot of the conversations we've had recently about cultural competence. The idea that, well, being a police officer, it's while they might still have the same ethnicity as you or be in the same region as you, there is a difference in having that job. It can be a very close-knit community. I think that's true about a lot of jobs that have been around for a long time, that these small cultures have built up around them. And just thinking that, well, I know science and therefore I know how to fix every problem, regardless of whether that is an accurate statement or not, is not going to always be taken as well as we would like it to be taken. So that is a very good point. I guess that would be true if you were, say, going to do similar research with fire departments, or what are some other jobs that probably have similar
artists.
EMTs? Yep.
Yeah.
Artists.
Florists.
I don't know about florists.
I don't know. I'm kind of drawing a blank here. But I do know what you're saying,
Yes.
right? So like any job where there's a close-knit group is going to really function as a subculture. And if you're an outsider from that group, then you may not understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
What the
So
reinforcers and values are there.
yeah, when you're starting out, ask more questions than you provide feedback initially to make sure that you have a good idea of how they operate and what their world is like, sort of thing. Because it's easy to go in and make all sorts of suggestions about what the perfect study would be and how we can get perfect experimental control, but you have to keep in mind what kind of a burden you're going to be on the academy when you make those suggestions and whether or not you're going to be asked back in the future if you overstep your bounds.
I don't think I'd want to alienate an entire region of police officers with my brusque methods. It's not going to be taken too well, I would suppose. And I also liked your point too, John, about our own field. It's easy to say, well, we have the answers with BST. And then you think about, well, how many times have we been in settings, whether they're school settings or, private clinical settings, where you see staff not having been trained to the criterion of mastery that we would like? I certainly don't think we, as in our own field, should be throwing stones. I don't think we have so many of the answers. They're not all implemented, and it's not the same from state to state or region to region or country to country at this point. So there's always work to be done, even in our own, area where we should have all the answers. We should be able to do all of these things. I think that's an important point. We don't always have those criterion, and we don't always have training methodologies that are effective, even when we know what they are.
We have a few things in common with police officers. One being treatment integrity, another being staff retention and staff training. There are a lot of things that behavior analysts have in common that they could have discussions with police trainers about. That might be an area to start in, say, hey, I train these folks to implement these types of procedures, maybe talking about emergency restraints and those sort of things, or even just the general behavior analytic procedures that you use, and talk about how your staff skills maintain over time, or if they maintain over time, and how you go about addressing that.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask, what advice might you have for behavior analysts who are interested in working in a field other than special education ASD? How do you get in there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that I have the answer, but the way that
John.
right. Well, let me tell you. The way that I went about it was I was given an opportunity, and, like Skinner famously said, if you find something interesting, drop everything else and go after it. And that's what I did, and it worked out. And if it's something that you're passionate about, you'll find a way to make it work.
So this company already looking for a behavior analyst, or you presented yourself as saying, I'm interested in this. Are you interested in me?
Yeah, they weren't particularly interested in behavior analysis. I think when we did the interview process, I think it was apparent to them that we had something to offer in an applied respect. Everything, all of my prior research was of direct benefit to the participants of the study. And that's something that they valued as well. And it's obviously something that police academies value. They don't want to conduct research that's not going to help them out in the long run. So keeping that in mind, is your study actually going to be of benefit, direct benefit to them?
And then once you were there, you sought out your colleague, William Spence. So folks who knew the field in that regard to help mentor you in the process of what you need to know about policing.
Yeah, Officer Spence was actually with us from the get-go. So he learned a lot about behavior analysis in the process. So he knew everything about the law enforcement world. We knew all the stuff, the scientific stuff. So we learned from each other and designed the study from the beginning. So yeah, he was involved from the ground up.
It's probably important, though. That's probably why it was successful, though, right? Because you didn't just go in and say, like, here's what I'm going to do as a scientist, without getting buy-in from the community first.
I think so. I don't think we would have got through the front door if we didn't have an officer involved.
Yeah. Certainly would lend it some sense that you actually are interested in what they're already doing rather than coming in to tell them what they should be doing.
Yeah, exactly.
When you say it like that, I don't think I'd want to hire someone who came to me with that either. Hey, we're here to tell you how to do your job better because you're not doing it very well. Oh, thank you. Goodbye. So nice of you to come by. Oh, boy. It was fascinating, John. It was really great to hear about an area where we can apply behavioral science that, honestly, I don't think until we were talking about having you coming on the show, I even thought was something that could be done. It just seems so outside the typical realm. But the principles were all there, and the findings were all, very much in line with, similar research in terms of never enough time, have to be able to look, make your TAs. What is it you're actually hoping to accomplish in these trainings or in this setting? It's just very exciting. It was really, really great to get a chance to talk to you about this and get all your information. So thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity.
Yeah. Do you have any, I always call it plugs because that's what I hear on other podcasts, but that doesn't make sense for our field. So do you have any contact information that you'd like to share with the audience? People want to learn more about your work or just contact you in general?
Yeah, you can go to cbsinstitute.org. That's our company where we do all the research. We're on Facebook at Contextual Behavioral Science. You can email me directly at research@cbsinstitute.org. And yeah, that's about it.
Excellent. All right. Well, we want to thank Dr. O'Neill for being on the show. We also want to thank all of you for listening. Before we do our end of show spiel, I want to make sure that you all get that second secret code word, and it is buckle. BUCKLE. Dinah drew a little picture of a belt buckle in her notebook, so that was very helpful to remind me that second code word.
You're welcome.
Buckle. Well, I want to say to everyone out there, thanks so much for listening to ABA Inside Track. If you enjoyed the show, please think about subscribing or leaving us a review. You can find our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also reach out to us through social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. I kind of threw them together there as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes also posted on our website, abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to the articles and information about getting CEs. And these also go up on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. And finally, don't hesitate to email us as well at abainsidetrack@gmail.com.
We'd like to thank our musicians, Jim Carr for our intro and outro music, and Kyle Sturry for our music interstitial. We would also like to thank Daniel Thabit as our editor and Hollis Irvin of the Sycamore Workshop for providing graphic design.
Yes, good job, Diana. And big thank yous also to all of you again for listening. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye-bye!